hospitality. I had a great time with the students yesterday. Thank you all for helping to bring me here. And I've been telling people, I used to live in the South many, many years ago down in Alabama. And I know my parents brought me here, but I don't remember it. So it was great to come back again and see Knoxville, which I think has changed in the past many decades since I was here before. So it's been a wonderful interlude for me. So thank you all for that. I first became acquainted with Deborah's work maybe, 6, 7 years ago. And when I was invited to really represent the United States in the Ljubljana print biennial 4 or 5 years ago, I decided that I loved Deborah's work so much that I wanted to take her work to Ljubljana. And she doesn't make prints really, but as a print curator, I stretched boundaries all the time, and if I said it had something to do with printmaking, then I did it, and I used it, and I showed it. So there's this one part of Deborah's process, which is where she will take a masterpiece and map it out on a computer and pixelate it, and then she prints out those maps. So I said she was a printmaker because she printed out those maps. She would never let me show those maps because they're part of the secret of how she does her work. So while I called her a printmaker and took her to Ljubljana, nobody ever saw her prints, but everybody loved her there. And it was after that I decided to mount the exhibition in Brooklyn. And I guess that's what led to her coming here. But she's really she's great on so many different levels. I mean, kids can really appreciate her and get a wild feeling out of looking at what she does. Scientists love to look at her work from a very scientific point of view in terms of the way the brain coordinates vision. And I know that our historians like to look at her work because of what she does with contemporary work, and then she looks back. I think I really place her in a long line of history. So she's a great audience puller, and rightly so, because I think she deserves to be known, and she continues to work and grow and change. So I'm going to try to bring her up to the past year, starting with some of her earlier work. Deborah Sperber began her career, and this is something she did in 1998, as a sculptor in stone and bronze. However, life necessitated change, and after moving from Colorado to New York City, she realized it would be very difficult to make a living carving stone and working in bronze. So she changed her media, and the direction of her work made a huge transition. Sperber began to work with materials that, while the parts were smaller than stone and bronze, they were still three-dimensional and could be installed on a large scale. Next, please. She turned to modern-day technology, computers, and mundane objects that we see every day, spools of thread, chenille pipe cleaners, decals, and beads. Later, I'll cover a short history of her work, but first I'd like to place Deborah in a long continuum of the history of art and the way we, or the artists, see the world in which we live. That is, how each generation defines the reality that it sees. Deborah Sperber has been dissecting what she sees throughout her career. And what she sees is a consideration of the way in which the parts form the whole, and how science and technology intersects with art. She once remarked, when the brain is convinced it knows what it is seeing, in this case, initially fixating on what appears to be random arrangement of thread spools, the bottom level of data, the recognizable portrait, is overruled. This may explain why my use of thread spools creates such a jolt of wow experience when the viewer finally sees the representational imagery in the viewing sphere. You can see that sphere right here. And it's upstairs. Many of you have probably seen the works upstairs, so you know what I'm talking about. As the brain abruptly shifts focus from the individual spools, which are the parts, to the whole, which is the recognizable image. How does the way Deborah Sperber regard the image today reflect the consideration of the image in history? How does she fit into the history of artists' views of surfaces? There are a multitude of questions that one might ask. As in any discipline, the answers only beg more questions. An investigation into this matter will give us insights into Sperber for those who came before her as well. Next, please. One might take this topic of the image as far back as recorded art history, and yet I prefer to begin with photography, an art medium that challenged the maker and the viewer to see the definition of reality in a manner not previously done. It's fitting that I begin this lecture with photography and Vermeer. One reason that Sperber based some of her work on Vermeer was because he quite possibly used the camera obscura. She once remarked that, quote, a strong case has been made that Jan Vermeer used a camera obscura as a tool to draft many of his compositions. In my 4 actor Vermeer works based on Jan Vermeer's The Music Lesson, which you see on the right, I transformed the music lesson into works that resulted in images similar to what Vermeer saw and projected inside his camera obscura. So you might imagine that Sperber's final work on the wall, which are these inverted spools, was what Vermeer saw in the camera. And what we see through the acrylic sphere is what Vermeer's final work on the wall looked like. As she often does, Sperber flips realities back and forth and forces us to consider which one is actual, and in the end, does it really matter? Next, please. This is a William Henry Fox Talbot image from 1839, or circa 1839, which was when photography was invented. The word photography comes from the Greek photos, meaning light, and graphos, meaning writing. Indeed, in its infancy, these new images were referred to by William Henry Fox Talbot as drawings, and he remarked, "The pictures thus formed resemble the productions of the artist's pencil more, perhaps, than any of the others." And he saw the utility of these images in their capacity to copy other drawings, engravings, or manuscripts. In other words, Talbot considered the early uses of these images primarily as records or reflections, a reality that actually was present in another object. His surface was merely a document, as any paper record might be, and he never questioned what was below that surface, nor did he think about what made up the surface of the image. In this instance, Talbot's reality was not in the image, but in the source. Similarly, in 1853, Sir William Newton wrote that one must never try to reproduce nature with photography, when painting could be far more effective in representing the glories of the natural landscape. He said, "Who has not studied nature so much as to observe how beautifully she throws her atmospheric veil, detaching each object, while producing that harmony and union of parts which the most splendid specimen of commercial photography fails to realize? Consequently, at present, it is in vain to look for that true representation of light and shade in photography, which is to be found in a fine work of art," end quote. Continuing, he maintained that photography should never strive to depict every detail, but rather to, quote, "endeavor at producing a broad and general effect, by which means the suggestions which nature offers, as represented by the camera, will assist his studies materially." Next, please. Is this what Sperber would do with her computer-driven art 150 years later? Was she to give us a general effect and suggestive or similitude that we know elsewhere? But is her reality a different kind of existence? Isn't she questioning authenticity when she presents us with her reality on the right, based on Dali's real painting on the left, that is actually a play on an earlier depiction, a photograph of Abraham Lincoln right here? This gets deeper and deeper. Next, please. Consider Degas and Manet in the late 1850s to the mid-1860s. In these two works, their reality found itself preoccupied with the idea of shapes on the canvas. One might dissect the image of the Boelli family as a grouping of distinct triangles and rectangles that form the structure upon which the figures and their glances are superimposed. And if you really look at this, you can see that it's made up of all kinds of triangles and rectangles throughout the composition, which is one of the ways one can look at the manner in which Degas constructed his compositions. Manet's Pfeiffer is a flat shape placed upon the surface of his canvas. These painters were recasting the manner in which the human eye looked at nature and represented that vision on a two-dimensional surface. This proclivity to dissect the surface as a method in which to form the image will also appear in Deborah Sperber's work. Yet she will first deconstruct and then reconstruct her image entirely, while Manet and Degas would construct their compositions within the armature that they defined. One wonders if these two artists were creating such structures of nature that they felt was present in the relatively new invention of photography. Next, please. Jumping ahead a bit, but still concerning ourselves with those underlying structures, several years later, similarly, but even more basic and simplified, in these two images, Degas and Seurat would seek the essential form in a manner that stripped even more details from the composition. This left the viewer to fill in the gaps in the depicted pictorial conventions. The detailed truth, then, came in the mind's eye. The surface reflected a stripped reality or one might also say a different and more fundamental level of verisimilitude. Next, please. In the early 1870s, the Impressionist painters began to cover the surfaces of their canvases with marks that would reflect not only a tangible reality, but one that defined and encompassed their entire environment. This was not well received by some critics, as one wrote that the Impressionists were not maintaining, quote, the science of painting, the construction of groups, the arrangement of draperies, the beauty of effects, and the artfulness of their means. One questioned what the reviewer meant by science when the Impressionists were concerned with the science and color and perception. Another reviewer angrily noted that, quote, looking at the first rough sketch, and rough is the right word, you might simply shrug your shoulders and say, seeing the lot, you burst out laughing, but with the last ones you finally get angry. And you are sorry you didn't give the franc you paid to get in to some poor beggar on the street. End quote. Quite clearly, these critics were not ready to see the unfinished qualities of a painting as integral to a visual interpretation of reality. Nor were they able to understand that by beginning to break up the surface into parts of the whole, one was creating a different type of existence and a new definition of truth. Next, please. Others saw these deliberate, unfinished surfaces as an endeavor to capture ethereal effects. This truth was one that transcended glistening and precise surface definitions that had been praised so often in earlier 19th century art. And you can see the aim on the right. Consider the treasured surfaces of daguerreotype photographs or the very finished surfaces of an artist such as any. One need only look at La Grenouille, painted in 1869 by Monet and Renoir, to see their preoccupation with these issues. The surfaces glisten as in the aim, but here the flat surface has been respected for what it is, and the pigments sit on that surface. The artists are breaking down what they see and creating a new verisimilitude. And these marks are defining the world as the Impressionist artists are beginning to see it. Where am I going with all of this? Next, please. When Sperber deconstructs the Impressionist artists and those who follow them, she is actually deconstructing artists who are deconstructing their time-honored reality. In this process, Sperber is creating a fresh new kind of reality based upon her 21st century visions of the world around her, as defined not only by what she sees, but the science of visibility as well. And here you can see Deborah taking an image from Renoir, deconstructing it and reconstructing it on the bottom. Deborah said, I am interested in the link between art and technology. I am interested in how the eyes prioritize and reality as a subjective experience versus an absolute truth. As a visual artist, I cannot think of a topic more stimulating and yet so basic than the act of seeing, how the human brain makes sense of the visual world. 150 years earlier, the Impressionists were thinking in similar ways. Next, please. How is Sperber's work any different from what Seurat was doing in the late 19th century? What the pointillists did with their mind's eyes, Sperber is doing with her computer. She's using 20th and 21st century tools and creating her contemporary interpretations of ways of seeing based upon a science that extends back into history. Her materials, be they chenille pipe cleaners, spools of thread, or beads, become like computer pixels, or even more fundamentally, Seurat's dots of paint. And when I have to digress for a minute and say that when I first started thinking about Deborah's work, and then look back at the Impressionists, I realized that we all know they were geniuses. But when I think about the fact that what Deborah is doing with the computer, the Impressionists did up here, it makes it even more astounding that they were able to do what they did. While we know that the late 19th century artists arrived at their ideas through a prevalent scientific study of color and its properties, Sperber references the science of vision as she once remarked, my interest in the biology of vision grew from my desire to understand how viewers experience my work, how the human eyes and the brain process sensory data. Photons bouncing off the spools of thread reach our eyes where they are turned into a pattern that is sent to the primary visual cortex where the rough shapes are recognized. And again, you're talking about rough shapes being recognized. Remember that Seurat drawing that we looked at. And if you look at his Seurat's Conti crayon drawings, they're absolutely gorgeous. And they are so primary, and it's our brain that finishes his image. The pattern is sent to higher regions where colors are recognized and where thread spool identities are encoded, along with other knowledge we already have about thread spools. The eye sees, the brain interprets one way, and in the case of the spool pixelated paintings, the acrylic sphere allows us to understand the work as it was meant to be viewed. And the Impressionists did this trick without the use of any technology. How did DeVoris Sperber get there? Next, please. In 1998, Sperber's installation, Humanity and How We Got This Way, consisted of 29 digital images on the wall covering, and you can see them, the digital images coming around the wall. In Sperber's words, the narrative of the many significant stages of humanity's evolution. Starting in the year 1750 BCE, the images reflect spiritual, religious, and cultural events related to the rise of Judaism and Islam and the split between the two Semite populations, end quote. A significant portion of this installation is the grouping of three-dimensional forms on the floor, consisting of marching armies of Palestinians and Israelis facing off against one another. In addition to the quite obvious story of Sperber's interpretation of Middle East politics, we also see her formally struggling between the flat digital image on the wall and the three-dimensional forms on the floor. She began to reconcile these two factors in the works that she did in subsequent years. Next, please. In 2002, Sperber installed this three-dimensional rendering of a VW bus in an exhibition in New York. A clear shower curtain is covered with colored flower power stickers that, when seen together, form an image of a VW bus. Considered separately, these stickers embody the popular flower culture symbol of the 1960s and early 70s. Icons, which Sperber explains, continue to have a strong presence today due to the influence of the counterculture capitalist baby boomers, now in positions of power as CEOs, advertising executives, and designers. How serendipitous those days seem to the post-9/11 world. Somebody went through that. I agree with her. Sperber's intention was to create low-tech pixels of these symbols. In the process, Sperber was making a statement about the generation of the 1960s. She maintained that when viewed up close, the translucent flowers on clear vinyl in the foreground fade in and out of recognition as the eyes shift focus from the translucent front panels through to the rear panels on the opposite side of the bus. The end result is an image of a VW bus that is there, yet not there, solid, yet transparent, present, yet fleeting, not unlike the ideals of the 1960s in the minds of many baby boomers today. The bus has become a mirage. It is a dreamt or remembered by some reality that is no more. Not only has Sperber captured the memory of a physical reality, but she has adroitly commented on the ideals that were real to so many of us in the 1960s, but ideas that have dissolved since then. Next, please. Now let me just explain this to you. This is DeVoris' work, and this is DeVoris' work, and on the bottom right is a detail of her work, and on the top right is the Jackson Pollock. Shadrach 165,000 consists of one, and that's on the top on the left, both images on the left. Consists of 165,000 2-inch chenille stems stuck in the foam core. It was modeled after Pollock's Autumn Rhythm, which Sperber deconstructed in the computer down to the most essential pixels. She marveled at the fact that Pollock was able to create in his drip paintings such, quote, high ratios of fractals, end quote, that enabled her to use it as a prototype for this series. In this sense, Sperber opined that Pollock actually recreated nature better than any realist painter ever could have. But Sperber's intention was not just to reconstruct Autumn Rhythm. Rather, she used the work as a point of departure from which she made subsequent renditions of the painting, each one successively smaller, until she arrived at the smallest work, which is merely 2 chenille stems, which you can just barely see as a little tiny dot on the wall on the left in the upper left-hand image. Each work in the series was necessarily more and more abstract and created in its own verisimilitude and environment. Is the most distilled image the most truthful? Next, please. When the Montclair Art Museum invited Sperber to make a site-specific installation in their building, she decided to work with their iconic copper painting Coast Guard station, which you see on the right. The title of the exhibition was Quartered, Flipped, and Rotated, and that is exactly what she did with the hopper painting. Next, please. Here you see on the top right, Sperber assembling the 5 works for the Montclair piece, and you see the 5 works hanging on the wall. Actually, you see 4 of the works on the wall. The top work is the hopper. Using chenille stems, she manipulated the hopper in the computer, arriving at 2 images that paid homage to the strong Southwest Native American collection in Montclair, and 2 images that resembled landscapes, again, to strengthen the museum collection. So you can see that this one and that one are the landscapes, and this one and this one look like the Native American art that she's referring to. The wallpaper is, if you look really closely, is based upon the 4 images that Sperber derived from the painting. She was especially pleased that the results were as much a mixture of tropes of American and Native American art as Western culture's elevation of high art and degradation of low art. That was quoting DeVore. This, too, as we now see, is another prevalent concern of Sperber's. Using prosaic materials, she pushes boundaries of definitions of art, of science, of perceived realities, and of tested truths. Next, please. One might say that DeVore has come full circle within art history with her works from the past few years. These figures of Star Trek characters beaming up are made of small beads, not unlike the pointillist dots that Seurat used over 100 years ago. Next, please. Sperber has been mulling over working on the Star Trek theme for years. In March 2008, she opened Mirror Universe at a gallery in New York. Taken from the episode of Star Trek, where the crew of the Enterprise is swapped with the crew of evil counterparts from a parallel universe, Sperber continued to explore dualities, realities, reflections of the real to create another truth. It should come as no surprise to this audience, after having had the opportunity to view the exhibition here, that Sperber uses mirrors to see parallel realities in many of her works, and certainly in the Mirror Universe installation. Which is that? Next, please. I think I might have left it. Oh, yeah. Okay, so here you see the installation, and here you see other works that are in that installation. But she's also using all of the other tools that we have been discussing here today. So you see the mirrors on the left, you see the thread spools on the top right, and on the bottom you see chenille stems, including thread spools and chenille. They are used to serve Sperber's definition of reality as put forth by her, but further defined by each of us. It is an individual reaction. But when we talk about mirrors, have we come full circle in another way as well? Next, please. This is a daguerreotype that was done in 1857. The 19th century photograph was seen as a mirror into a world of the past. Sperber is merely mirroring with 21st century implements, but she is making us ask the same questions. Perhaps the issues of reality are not really very different during any time period. Perhaps over the centuries, we just use different languages, but arrive at many of the same conclusions. Through the years, artists have thought about truth, critics have written about it, and the viewer has considered it. Maybe we are just looking at the same thing through a little bit of a different prism. In this instance, DeVore Sperber's prism. Thank you. Should I entertain some questions here? No questions?
I was wondering how big are the beads in the stock?
Little.
They're really small.
Yeah. They're almost like the pointillist dot. I mean, they're very little.
This is not a question, but something that I've been going through sort of reminded me of some of her philosophy about her work. Is I'm losing my taste buds, and I'm losing my taste buds. And in order to enjoy food at all, I can't taste what it tastes like, just texture. But my eyes look at it, and I remember in my head what it's supposed to taste like, and I kind of get that idea in some of the things she's saying about picturing reality and
right, and other sensory perceptions are taking over.
Right.
Just a few thoughts. I really like the connection you're making here between optical mixing with Seurat and her work, but it also seems as if there's such a rich precedence in the 18th century in terms of anamorphisms and optics and the importance of the lens and developing the telescope and the microscope, that's also, I would think,
I think very much.
if you had another hour,
Yeah.
the 18th century as well as the 19th century could be
I could
positioned
go
as...
way back to that, and there are a number of prints that would show that as well. So, you know, that's right. I had a lot more time.
But the other thing that it makes me think of is people justify abstraction in art as something that's based on liberating the artist from mimetic representation. You know, that the camera now does that. And so justifications for Kandinsky and other early investigations of non-objective art are premised on the idea of the presence of the photograph liberates the painter from this kind of representation. I think it does in a certain sense, but I think what her work points to, as well as, you know, people like Hockney's book on the influence of the camera lucida and camera obscura on painting, is that in fact the technologies of representation and reproduction are always tools that artists use, and they're ones that inform our world. So to think that you can just concede all forms of mimesis and representation to cameras is a rather short-lived sense of how artists can work in the world. You know, if we look at the early 20th century and abstraction. And hers is a different kind of abstraction that's based on those optics in a way.
Based very strongly on those optics, and yet liberating in a certain way as well. So it's a great observation. Yes.
Continuing with Bouvet's commentary on optics, do you have the background on holding and
The piece that's upstairs.
yeah, I mean, did he mess around with optics? You know,
Some people I think have said he did.
I mean, the expanded skull thing.
I can't.
Laura says you can do that with a ruler and a pencil,
Yeah.
but that one can. I think it's really hard to do. Yeah, they've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah.
But would they have done it because they were first inspired by messing around with some type of optics? Which came, you know, kind of chicken and the egg, which came first?
Well, I mean, I think this whole idea about optics can go as far back as we know to Leonardo. I mean, you see him doing a lot of that too. So it's hard to say. I don't know that. I'm not a Holbein scholar, so I don't know if we have any documentary evidence that he did that or wrote about it. But it certainly goes back before him.
You're a print person, and I think I'm correct in saying that she never editions her work. They're all unique, and that doesn't. And I wish I'd asked her when she was here why, because it's a sort of mechanical process of making the actual object, because it's all mapped out on the computer. And have you ever talked to her about why?
I think she considers her pieces unique sculptures in a way, and so I think that's why she doesn't edition them. I've never really asked her that question. And I know I stretched every boundary in the world to put her into a printmaking show.
Well,
But, you know,
they're unique prints.
Well, they're not even prints, but that was the license of me as a print curator, taking one little part of her production and doing that. But I think she sees them as unique objects, and while one could reproduce them, you could say that about anything too. One could reproduce anything.
But it's just a sequence of spools of
Right.
thread, so you could, once you have it all written down, you could just hand it off to your assistant. They can make as many as you have.
It's like a Carl Andre is equally editionable because
Or a solid lid is equally editionable too. I mean, his wall drawings are equally as, you can do it anywhere, but if you don't have a license to that format, you can't. He doesn't.
But it has something to do with the way she thinks about her work.
Right,
and